Alrighty, welcome back everyone. We just talked about the NCAA versus House case and how that settlement is coming more and more close to being reality. And with that becomes a big time pay that is going to have to be doled out from these colleges. And the question is, how do you deal with that? And one of the big answers that has kind of been popping up recently is private equity. Obviously, this new deal is going to cost $300 million over the next 10 years, whether it's from pulling money away from what you get from the NCAA or paying that revenue sharing. There's going to be a lot of money going towards this over the next decade, and not everyone has that money, as we talked about, and it's definitely something where they're really looking for any answer they can get. And Drew Weatherford is someone that is more than willing to give them that answer. He is a former Florida State quarterback that has been, I think, played there from about 2007 to 2010 in that kind of range, and since then has become kind of a private equity trader, has become a very, very, powerful, successful guy. He's opened Redbird Capital and Weatherford Capital that are two programs that are kind of coming together to create collegiate athletic solutions. So this is kind of a new program. We've heard a lot of different new entities been popped up around college sports. This is just the newest in that line, and it's very interesting. It's one of those things where you look at it from the outset and you have a lot of questions, right? It is a entity that has very little to do with the NCAA, very little to do with a lot of the rules that overarch the NCAA, and they're trying to get into the game. And the question is, I guess, how will this kind of affect the future of college football, the future of college sports, and how will it affect the decision making in these rooms, in these athletic departments? Because they have said in a lot of their conversations that they have no interest in being a part of the decision making. They have no interest in how these teams spend the money. They just want to give the money to the teams to make their ends meet. And I'd love to believe that. I really would love to be, totally believe that this is totally out of the kindness of their hearts and they're doing their best to save college sports. And that sounds like a great thing, but I'm a little bit skeptical of that just because of what has happened around college football and college sports over the last little bit. It's been a little bit sketchy, right? And there's not necessarily been a ton of people around, especially in big time positions of power, that have necessarily had the greatest, had the sport's best interests at heart, I suppose is the best way to put it. And I hope that this is a little bit different, but I suppose we'll find out. It sounds like Weatherford and Cardinale, who is his partner, Jerry Cardinale, are seeking about 5 to 10 programs to give as little as $50 million, as much as $200 million to. I don't know what that looks like in terms of payments. I don't know what that looks like in terms of who's going to be involved in those programs. They say they don't want any power. They say they don't want a position within the athletic department. I would find that a little bit hard to believe if you're writing over a check for $200 million to someone, but maybe they're really doing this out of the kindness of their hearts. Maybe they're really doing this for the right reasons, and I suppose we'll find out. They are not necessarily new to sports by any means. They acquired AC Milan, who is a massive, massive football team across in Italy, worth about $1.3 billion. They bought it back in 2022. They're in Formula One. They're in Fenway Sports Group, which is the Boston Red Sox owners. They're in Liverpool is another one they're involved in. So they're very much involved in sports and have been for quite some time. So this is not necessarily new to them. Now, it is a little bit new to college sports. It's not necessarily new to college in general. There are a lot of endowments that come from a number of different places. They just are rarely used in the athletic department in that way. So it's going to be really interesting. It's one of those things where at face value, you really want it to be just that, right? You want it to be exactly what they're saying it is, which is essentially an angel investment, essentially just something to keep all of these programs alive, something to make sure that college sports keep going as well as they can throughout this next little bit, which is going to cost them a ton of money and do things to some athletic departments that we don't want to see. And the question is first, what does this money look like? How does this how does this bear itself out in real time? What are the actual real impact of the money outside of, being able to pay those bills? Are there, additional asterisks added onto that? Are there, people involved in decision making that probably shouldn't be there. It's a very murky situation, but also it's hard to blame some of the schools for going this route or for trying to go this route, because you look at everything going on around the country, and you look at some of the books that are around athletic departments around the country. Some just absolutely need this to stay alive, and that's what they've said in this article. It's literally a question to one of the people very much involved in this, one of the athletic directors. They asked him, do you need this to be successful and survive? And he said yes. So it's very plainly, this is just the reality of the sport. If you're going to ask them to pay $300 million over the next 10 years, it's going to be hard for them to look internally and just say, we got to fundraise that amount of money. They just can't to a certain extent. So it's going to be one of those things that not only is going to be fascinating to watch which teams are involved, which I think is a conversation that is going to be really interesting, right? When you look at what teams could be involved, obviously the Big Ten and the SEC teams are a little bit less worried about this new influx of payments that are going to have to come. That's just the reality of where they stand. They have a little bit more ability to give out that $20 million. Now, not everyone in the SEC or the Big Ten are on the same footing, of course, but they do definitely have a little bit more of ability to foot this bill. Now, does Oregon State, does Washington State, do these other schools that are just a tier below them, but the books are kind of sketchy at times. I mean, we talked about UCLA, who are in the Big Ten. They are massively in debt when you talk about their athletic department, and it's been that way for the past couple of years. At some point, you got to start digging yourself out of that hole. And if this is the answer that they have to give for that, I don't necessarily blame them for doing it. Obviously, it's not what you want. It's not necessarily the way that I would love for this to go about, but you're looking around and you're saying, pay $300 million over the next 10 years, but also asking them to do it, entirely above board and not go out of their walls to get it is a little bit unrealistic, right? You don't necessarily have donors that are willing to give up that amount of money every single year for you to go about your business. So this is something that is very dangerous. I'll be totally honest. I don't necessarily know what this looks like in real time. I'm having a little bit hard time believing that this is fully out of the kindness of their heart, just trying to save college sports. I'd love to believe that, and him being a former college football player definitely does help that case a little bit, but I don't know. It's a very, very interesting situation where I don't really know how all of this fits in. I don't really know how private equity works in college sports. I don't really know where this money will go, and I don't really know if it necessarily will lead to many great things in this sport. But I do know that it kind of forced some teams' hand. And you hate to say that that's the reality, but when you look across the sport, everyone's on such uneven footing that at some point you got to do something to keep up. And if that's, adding a rocket booster of $200 million to your back, that's sometimes just what's got to happen. And it's definitely something that's going to be fascinating to watch. Is it the ACC and the Big 12 that take really good advantage of this? Is it Group of 5 teams? How much money goes out to these programs, and how is that money used? There's a million questions, and that's always going to be the case when someone like this from the outside comes into the sport and has this big of an effect, but it's kind of the reality that we live in. If you're in Tulane right now and you're trying to make those books work, especially with $20 million coming up next year, you got to go somewhere to find the money. And you have to do it relatively quickly, because these payments aren't coming, 5 years down the road. They're coming pretty much tomorrow, and you got to be ready for them. So it's going to be fascinating to watch all of this unfold. The way I look at it, it is a dangerous proposition, but maybe the only option for some of these athletic departments across the country. Now, can the NCAA step in and do something? Can they make this at least a little bit more above board than it seems like it will be right now? That's the hope, but from where I'm standing, the NCAA doesn't necessarily have a ton of power to do much. So it'll be fascinating to watch this unfold. I think this is the center of the storm. We've talked about a million different things on this show about the different changes and the different craziness going on around college sports and college football in particular. And we're right now in the eye of the storm. There's really no other way to put it. There's so much stuff changing. There's so many teams moving all over the place. There's so much sketchy happenings around college sports right now. But the reality is, I do think we're going to find our way out of it. I do think there is a light at the end of the tunnel, and I'll actually get into that a little bit tomorrow after we finish up with our guests. But the reality is, you can't necessarily ask someone to pay $300 million over 10 years and then not ask them, and then at the same time, not ask them to go out and use a little bit different of means to get that money. So it's not necessarily the way I want things to go, but it's the reality of college sports right now. Either you have money or you're not competing, and that's just kind of the way of things. So getting that money from this entity is one solution, and you'll take a solution where you can get it. But we're going to take our second break, and when we come back, we're going to talk about James Franklin. There were some very interesting allegations against him about possibly interfering with some medical decisions that were going on at Penn State. I'll get into the details of that and break down just how big of a deal this actually is and how it will affect James Franklin going forward. So stick around, and we will be right back with that.